Hello everyone, and welcome to the Global Mapper webinar for the month of March. Currently, all attendees are in a listen-only mode, which means you can hear the presenter, but your microphone is automatically muted. At this time, you should be able to see the introductory slide on your screen. If you need assistance or have connectivity issues during this presentation, please send an email to feedback@bluemarblegeo.com. Our support team will reply to you promptly. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can use the questions tool on the GoToWebinar panel to the right of your screen. Our panelists will try to answer your questions as they are submitted and, if necessary, the presenter will address any outstanding questions at the end of the presentation. We will respond to as many as we can during the session and will follow up via email on any remaining questions. Remember, for ongoing questions about the features and functions of Global Mapper, you can always email our support team at gmsupport@bluemarblegeo.com. Before we begin, we would like to announce a couple of upcoming events where you can come out and meet some of the Blue Marble staff and learn more about our software. The week of March 23rd, we will be at the IPTC conference in Beijing, China, and the ASPRS conference in Baltimore, Maryland. If you're planning to attend either of these events, please stop by our booth and say hi. We will be happy to show you the latest versions of our products or answer any other questions you may have. Blue Marble product experts will also be providing training at several locations over the coming months. During the week of April 29th, a 2-day Global Mapper course will be offered in Denver, Colorado, and the following week, beginning May 6th, Global Mapper training will be available in Calgary, Alberta. That same week, on Monday, we are offering a public applied geodesy course in Houston, Texas. Finally, during the week of May 21st, the 2-day Global Mapper training class will be offered in Oklahoma City. For more information, or to register for one of these classes, visit the Blue Marble website and click on the training link in the support menu. During today's presentation, which will be about 60 minutes in duration, we will consider several components of Global Mapper that have been designed to improve efficiency in data management. Among the topics will be the use of workspaces to effectively organize Global Mapper projects, batch data conversion, the use of feature types to assign symbolization and attribution, and creating scripts to automate data processing tasks. A recording of today's webinar will be available online and, along with previous webinars, can be accessed from the Blue Marble webpage. At this time, I would like to introduce David McKittrick, Senior Application Specialist at Blue Marble.
Thank you, Raina, and thank you all once again for joining us for our monthly Global Mapper webinars. As Raina mentioned, we will be spending the next 60 minutes or so talking about some of the specific components of Global Mapper that have been designed and developed to improve efficiency in data management to optimize your workflow, as you can see on my introductory slide. Workflow optimization is one of the underlying philosophies of Global Mapper, the ability to process data efficiently, to get it from one platform to another platform, perhaps running some conversions or reprojections as well. So we will go through some of the components of Global Mapper that have specifically been designed for that type of application. I should throw out a little bit of a disclaimer before we start. Most of the content of today's session is going to be of particular relevance for those of you who are currently using Global Mapper. I know we get a lot of people logging onto our webinars that are new to the software, or perhaps are interested in finding out about Global Mapper prior to purchasing. Hopefully, some of the content that we cover today will also be relevant to you, will give you an idea as to the capability of the software and show you some of the tools that we have available. So, as Raina mentioned, today's session is going to focus on workflow optimization. I'm just going to bring up a couple of slides here. We are going to go through various components of the software. Some of these, my hope is that you will understand or have used these functions already, but by way of kind of consolidating all of these workflow optimization tools, we're going to cover what would be some basic functions. The first of those being effectively organizing Global Mapper workflow through the use of workspaces. And what is it? We're going to talk about what a workspace is and how to use them effectively. We're going to show you some batch data conversion options. There's a tool within Global Mapper. I know not a lot of you have used it. We do get a lot of comments and questions coming into our support inbox about this particular function. We're going to show you how you can batch up your data conversion process. Another tool that's added, and this is a fairly recent tool, we've covered this in previous webinars, and again, to improve workflow, to improve efficiency in the use of the software, is assigning keyboard shortcuts. As the functionality of Global Mapper has become much more powerful, obviously some of those menus have become a little longer. Finding those tools may be a little more difficult. So we're going to show you how to optimize your interaction with the software by allowing you to assign keyboard shortcuts that follow your workflow and essentially streamline the interaction with your data. We are going to talk about feature types and how they can be assigned to features. Again, I see this as a workflow optimization, being able to import data and assign it to a particular data classification or data type as a means to create a more workable type of data, making it easier to interact with that data, having it visually representing what it's supposed to represent. We'll talk briefly about that as well. This is, again, something we've mentioned in the past in our webinars, grouping layers and using map catalogs as a way of organizing your overlay control center, the various layers that you have imported. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'm going to make sure we leave enough time for this final bullet, and this is about creating scripts. We have had a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of requests to provide more information on how the scripting process works in Global Mapper. Hopefully by the end of today's session you'll get a better idea as to how this works, and in truth you'll get a better idea as to how straightforward it is. I'm going to kind of plant a seed today. Hopefully you can take that seed and cultivate it for yourself and see how that works in your context. So with that, without any further ado, we're quickly going to jump into the software. We're going to take a look at some of these themes. I'm going to bring up an instance of Global Mapper, and first of all we're going to talk about workspaces. A workspace, for those of you who use Global Mapper, is our basic file, our basic data management file. By definition, a workspace is a file that stores configuration. Any configuration you apply to your work session, whether that be layers that you've imported or features that you've drawn or colors that you've assigned or labels that you've assigned, all of those components are saved in a workspace. At the end of your workday, you're ready to go home for the afternoon, you'll save your workspace, you can pick up where you left off the next day. Now, I want to show you a couple of variations on the workspace theme, just to kind of illustrate what a workspace is and what a workspace isn't. Now for this, I'm simply going to import a layer. As you can see, I've got a sample layer on my screen. This happens to delineate some properties or parcels. And let's assume I've been working on this and I'm ready to leave at the end of the day. And in this case, I've imported a shapefile. This is an external file. I could go to my Windows Explorer and find where this file was imported from. So it exists as a file format. I'm going to save this as a workspace. Very simply, just use my Save dialog box. I'm just going to call this Test, and I'm going to click Save. Now, the file that I saved records the presence of the file in my Global Mapper interface, and it records the path to the original location of the file. I'm going to open up a different workspace, and I'm going to show you exactly the same data. But in this case, this is simulating a drawing process. Perhaps I've actually created these parcels using my digitizer tool. It looks exactly the same, but I use this as a way to illustrate how if you're creating features in Global Mapper, in other words, if you're using your digitizer tool to draw features in the application, those features are essentially stored in a workspace. Now, again, to illustrate this point, I'm going to bring up the two files that I just created. My test workspace that I just saved is 5K. It's a very small file, and the reason for that is because it referenced a file that exists on my hard drive. Basically, the workspace simply contains the path to that file, whereas the other file that I simulated, where I pretended that I drew all those parcels, actually contains a lot more data, and that's because those drawn features are actually contained within the workspace itself. So, a workspace will record the path to a file, but it will also record any features that you draw or edit or create or modify, and that's what a workspace does. Now, we usually caution against sharing workspaces. Although I was able to browse to the location of those files on my local hard drive, if I try to send that workspace to another user, the path to the files may be broken, may not be relevant. So somebody who loads my workspace will get an error message saying it couldn't find the original shapefile. If your workspace contains just drawn features, then it will work in that context. But again, we usually recommend that workspace files are just used for your local consumption only. So once again, just by way of very basic introduction, a workspace file is a very efficient way to manage your data, to store paths to files, and to store those configurations. Using workspace files really does increase your efficiency. I have worked with customers using Global Mapper who have basically everything in one workspace. All of the layers they work with is in a single workspace. Not very efficient. We do recommend using workspaces to organize data by project or organize data by location, perhaps. Bear in mind that a single file can be referenced by more than one workspace. So we could have two instances of a particular file, but referenced by two workspaces and configured in different ways. So again, using workspaces in a methodical way, you can improve your efficiency. The little note I have in my notes here is don't put all your eggs in one basket. In other words, don't feel you have to put all of the relevant data into one workspace. Break your workspaces out, organize your data. It makes your experience with Global Mapper a lot more straightforward. With that, I am actually going to import. Let me just remove the file that I have, and we will not save our workspace in this case. I'm going to bring in the same layer that I brought in before. Again, this is just a simple little shapefile. And let's say perhaps I want to work on this shapefile for a particular project. Perhaps I need to do something else with a version of this. Global Mapper allows you to create and to run two instances of the application simultaneously. I'm just right-clicking on my menu bar here, and I'm going to open up the application again. Now, what you're going to see here is we're actually going to have two versions of Global Mapper that are running concurrently. Perhaps I'm going to use one for maybe processing some raster files. That typically takes a little bit longer. So you might want to run that, but at the same time, you may want to do some digitizing or may want to work with some other data sets. People often ask if they're introduced to this function, is this violating the license? If I have two concurrent instances running on my machine, well, that's absolutely not a violation of your license. You can use multiple instances of Global Mapper to process data simultaneously or concurrently. So again, I could bring up exactly the same file in this second instance of Global Mapper. I'll just bring up my parcels once again. Difficult to see a difference here, but I actually have two instances, and I could be independently processing these, referencing the same file, and if I save the workspaces, it's going to save just the configuration for that local instance of the software. So again, using workspaces, using multiple instances of Global Mapper as an efficiency tool. Hopefully that's not a new function or a new component of Global Mapper. Hopefully you've all been using workspaces effectively all along. Next thing we're going to cover is our batch processing tool. And again, I'm just going to unload my data. Batch processing is a component of Global Mapper that allows you to, as the name implies, to batch process, to work with multiple files simultaneously. Typically the way this would work is if you have a folder with a collection, let's say, of shapefiles. The batch processing tool will let you take each of those files individually and either convert them to another format and or reproject them if necessary. And the batch processing tool is accessed from within the file menu. Right about halfway down my file menu, you'll see batch, convert, and reproject. And it brings up a couple of dialog boxes that let me specify exactly how this process is going to work. Obviously, we can only work with one format at a time using this tool. So I'm first asked, well, what's the format of the data that I'm converting from? In other words, what is my source data? Well, in my case, it is shapefile, so I'm just going to go with that option. What do I want to convert those to? You'll notice that the available options reflect the same options you have when you use the software itself. The interface, you're actually working with data in a visual context. Same options for exporting. I'm going to choose my KML, KMZ. I want to maybe work with this data set in a Google Maps or Google Earth environment. So I want to convert my shapefiles to Google Earth files. And we'll click OK. And it then prompts us to choose the files. And you'll see this dialog box is essentially a interface that allows us to select source files, to apply the parameters on my conversion, and then essentially click OK to initiate that process. So what I'm going to do is add some files. I'm actually going to go even further. I'm going to add all of the files in a defined directory rather than adding them individually. And in my case, although we can't see the files themselves, this folder called Texas actually contains, I think, about a dozen shapefiles, all of which share common attributes. They're all essentially the same type of file, but just broken up. And I want to process them all individually as well. So we'll click OK. And would I like to search all the subdirectories? In other words, if there's any subfolders, in which in my case there isn't, but we'll just click OK in this just in case. And you'll see then we have each of those files now added to my source file list, and they're each individual shapefiles I had mentioned before. In this case, these happen to be Texas Railroad Commission regions for the state of Texas, and you can see the numeric values reflected in the names. So then we have our files in place. We can decide what to do with those files after they've been imported. We can specify our output directory or put them in the same directory as they were imported from, and that's what I'll do in my case. I can append a name, part of a name to each file that's generated. So I'll put the abbreviation converted, or we could put whatever we want in there as a adaptation of the original name. In my case, I'm not really that concerned because these are actually going to be a different format. I'm going to generate my KMZ files, so I'm not really concerned about that. Putting an appended name may be more appropriate if you're simply reprojecting but keeping the format the same. So you'll want to put something to imply that the new files are actually in a different format. And perhaps in that case, it may also be a good idea to specify a different output directory. Now, you'll notice projection is not available for me in this case because a KMZ has a defined projection. I don't have the ability to set the projection parameters specific to this format, but if it were another format that did support those multiple projections, I obviously could specify the output projection parameters as well. I have the option of defining a gridding or a tiling process, and then options specific to the format. In my case, I do want to create my compressed KMZ as opposed to the KML, and I've got a number of options I can specify. So again, setting this up, I simply click OK. It will run through the process. You'll see my dialog boxes indicating that the process is running. And just to verify that it actually worked, I'm going to open up my Texas folder. And hopefully, yeah, we can see if I sort by type, we can now see as I scroll down, I had previously a number of shapefiles, and now I've got a number of KMZ files as well. So very simple. And obviously, in this case, it was a matter of a dozen or so files. Needless to say, this process would work with vast quantities of data. So you can essentially set this up to run overnight. Perhaps if you're dealing with processing rasters, which we know takes a little bit longer, this batch processing tool will run through that process. Come in the next day, all of your data has been processed, converted, reprojected, whatever. And it's very simple and very straightforward. Now, in this case, you will have noted that when I imported or processed each of those individual shapefiles, it generated an individual output file as well. So there was no option to combine the files into a single file. I'm going to talk a little bit later about a tool that we can use to do that, which is essentially a scripting tool where we can define multiple input files and perhaps export those as a single output file. Or for that matter, if we imported these files directly using our standard import tool in the interface, we could then combine them by doing a single export. So that would be an option if we actually use the standard functionality of the software. But once again, just an example of how our batch processing works to generate multiple files for multiple input files. Okay, as you can see, I'm repeatedly using the same data here. I'm going to bring up my old friend, my parcel there again. I'm going to use this to illustrate another efficiency tool within Global Mapper. Now, specifically, this is a tool that we have developed recently for simplifying the interaction with various tools in the software by assigning keyboard shortcuts. The drop-down list that you'll see in the toolbar, and by the way, if you're using a version of Global Mapper prior to version 14, you will not have this function in there. This is, again, a relatively new function in the software. There are two main features of this drop-down list. One is to assign what we call favorites, and favorites can simply be selected from this list and then initiated using the little button adjacent to the drop-down list. I personally think a more useful function is to actually go one step further and assign keyboard shortcuts to those functions. So I'm going to do that very quickly just to show you some workflow examples, and again, how it simplifies your interaction with the software. So we bring up our keyboard shortcuts list, and the dialog box prompts us to choose from a very, very long list of available functions. And you can read through these individually, find what it is that you use repeatedly, and rather than having to go to a menu to find it, assign it to a keyboard shortcut. Now, I have a few examples. Probably one that you may all want to choose here is our standard edit function. Thankfully, they are alphabetized, so it's fairly easy to find. Anybody who uses the digitizer in any way is familiar with this function. The ability to edit. The edit tool, as you're probably aware, allows you to edit the attributes. It allows you to assign data to a layer, change a feature type. So it's a very, very commonly used function. I'm going to assign that tool to a defined feature, to a defined keyboard shortcut. Specifically, in this case, I want to assign it to my F2 key on my keyboard. I'm going to add that one to the list. I'm going to do a couple more as well. Let's do our name and save current view, one of my favorite tools. Again, alphabetized. If we scroll down to the ends, you'll see name and save current view. By the way, this tool, if you haven't used it already, allows you to record a geographic location, name it, and then very easily recover or restore that view later if you need. Independent of saving the workspace, you can actually save a map view within a workspace. Extremely useful for workflow optimization. So again, in this case, I'm going to choose F3, and we'll update that list. And you can see I'm starting to build my own list here. We'll do one more. And obviously, if we're naming and saving a view, we want a way to access that. So I'm going to choose my restore named view. And again, thankfully, they are alphabetized. If I could remember my alphabet, restore named view. And we'll use F4 for that particular instance. And again, add or update. So obviously, if you're doing this, you'll want to make note of what your keyboard shortcuts are. Hopefully, eventually, you remember these. But in my case, F1, or F2, F3, F4. Well, by the way, F1 is not an option because it's the standard help option. So if you hit F1 or try to assign F1, it will not allow you to do that because F1 brings up our help menu. We'll close the window. Now, using the first option, I just simply choose my dialog, my digitizer tool, click on a feature in the map, hit my F2 button, and bingo, I've just brought up my modify feature info. Don't have to go to any menus, don't have to right-click, don't have to figure out where that function is. It's assigned for me automatically as a keyboard shortcut. Similarly, in this case, I'm going to zoom into an area of interest, and I want to save this. I'm going to use my F3 option. I'm going to give it a name. We'll call it test, and we're good, and that's fine. We'll save it to multiple workspaces. I'll zoom out to my entire extent again. I want to go back to that named location. Again, you can't see this part of the process, but I'm hitting the F4 key on my keyboard, and there's my named locations. In this case, I've only got one. I simply click OK, and I'm back to where I was. So as you can see, one click or one keyboard stroke or selection on my keyboard allows me to very quickly initiate specific processes that are relevant to my workflow. Again, improving efficiency, improving your interaction with the software. I obviously just chose 3 examples. There are multiple tools that can be assigned in this way, and obviously your use of this tool will reflect the way that you use the software. Okay, let me jump back out to my full view of my parcels once again. And by the way, I'm clicking the home button and the full view in my toolbar, this little home button, and it takes me out to the full extent of any layer that has been imported. Again, a theme that we've talked about in the past in a different context is the ability to assign specific characteristics to features that you've imported or created. The way that we encourage you to do that is to essentially assign those to a predetermined feature type. I could, if I wanted to, select individual features on my map. Again, we've used the keyboard shortcut edit, so I could go through that process and change the colors or change the attributes as necessary. Not usually recommended because you're essentially dealing with individual features and it becomes a little more difficult to manage. So what I want to show you is how we can assign features, assign characteristics to features universally that match all of the characteristics that we require for those features. Global Mapper comes with a number of these pre-configured. I'm going to open up my configuration dialog box. I'm going to choose my area styles, because in this case we're going to be assigning these characteristics to the layer that we've imported, which is an area or a polygon layer. And I'm going to go to my area styles. Now my area styles includes, as I said, a list of pre-configured area types. So for instance, if I wanted to assign all of my imported features to be intermittent streams or rivers, again, that can be done in a fairly straightforward, fairly automated way. What you'll find almost without exception are the types of features that you map will not be in here. Obviously, not everyone deals with national parks or oceans or orchards or plantations. It's more likely that you will have requirements beyond the scope of what's included in here, and for those situations, we have this new type option. In my case, I'm dealing with properties or parcels, so I'm going to create a new type. I'm going to call it parcels. I can assign the fill color. I'm going to use a solid fill. I'm going to make it a red color just to make it distinct. And I want to make them just partially transparent. Maybe I want to overlay these on some rasters, and I want to see some of the raster features as well. In other words, I can obviously customize the visual characteristics for this particular type. And we'll click OK. Other options we can assign here, we can pre-populate this feature type with predetermined attributes. So if you're drawing parcels and you want to make sure that every time you assign a feature to this new feature type parcels, you will automatically have relevant attribute fields without having to create them manually. So I'm not going to do that in this case, but that's another option when creating a feature type. So I'm going to click OK on this dialog box, and just to illustrate this process, first I'm going to generate or create a new area feature just to simulate the process. Digitizer, as you know, just left-click to outline the feature, right-click to finish, and it will pop up our Modify Feature Info dialog box. And from this feature type list, I have all of those predetermined feature types as well as my parcels, the one that I created. So that is how that option works. Now I'm going to escape from this right now. I'm not going to follow through with this process, and we will just go back to where we were. One of the problems with kind of this workflow is that you'll see that's a very long list of feature types. And again, if I map 2 or 3 different feature types, I don't want to have to scroll through the orchards and the oceans and the national parks to find what it is that I want. So I want to show you a way of making that process more efficient by filtering that list. Once again, we're going to open up the configuration dialog. This time we're going to go to our vector display tab. And in vector display, an oft overlooked function is this filtering options, where we can filter lines, points, and areas. And I'm going to choose my areas. You'll see these are all checked on by default. In other words, I'm going to have access to all of these pre-configured feature types, as well as my own custom feature type, which is my parcels. I don't need any others but my parcels, so I'm going to clear all. Use the clear all button, and then individually choose what it is that I want, which in my case is parcels. I should caution you that if you follow this workflow, make sure you remember what you've done, because I've encountered situations where I've tried to assign something to a particular type, and it just simply doesn't appear on the map, and I'm scratching my head trying to figure out why. It's because I chose to filter my list. Well, just, again, note to self, make sure you remember that you've done this, make sure you're aware of the consequences. This is obviously a very extreme situation. I'm only going to enable one particular feature type. I'm going to click OK. And once again, click OK. Now, here's a question. Why did my parcels all disappear? Well, the reason for that, obviously, is because the previous feature type, which was automatically assigned as an unknown feature, is now invisible. So, again, note to self, remember what you've done. But the benefit of this workflow is if I create a feature, my list is now limited to my feature types. Obviously, I don't want that long list. Maybe I have 3 or 4 or 5 different subtypes, but in my case, I've got one. I can assign it as a parcel, and it inherits the colors. It will inherit all of the other characteristics that I assigned. Again, to follow through with what I had described earlier, make sure you're aware of what you do. I'll go back into areas, and we'll select all once again. But again, use that tool to improve your efficiency, to improve the ability for you to assign features to a recognized and reusable feature type, making your workflow more efficient within Global Mapper. And we'll click OK. And there, obviously, we reverted back to the original format again. Okay, I'm going to unload my data. We'll get rid of our parcels for the time being. We'll come back and visit them again a little bit later. And we do not need to save our workspace in this case. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to load up the same data that we used for our batch processing. I'm going to use my standard open function. I'm going to go up one level. I'm going to actually want to sort by type. And we're going to use the shapefile version. In this case, I want to import multiple files simultaneously by holding my Shift button down. And we'll simply click OK, or open in this case. And we have features on the map. We have essentially imported several shapefiles that we can now see in our Overlay Control Center. As I mentioned previously when we were using the batch processing tool, these are all individual shapefiles. I have individual control over each of these regions. Also, what I mentioned earlier, we do have the ability, if necessary, to simply export, go through a standard export process, And as a consequence, it will consolidate all of these individual files into a single file, whether that be shape or KMZ or whatever format we want. So that is a means to combine multiple shape files into a single file. In this case, that would be a very relevant process because obviously these shape files all share a common characteristic. They all define the regions within Texas. But in terms of managing these various layers within the Overlay Control Center, having this list is not very efficient. Because if I want to, for instance, disable or uncheck all of these, I have to go down each one and uncheck them. So what I'm going to show you very quickly is a simple tool that we can use to group these together. I just held down my Shift button on my keyboard. I selected all of these. I'm now going to right-click. I'm going to choose Group. And when I choose Group, it's going to prompt me to type a name. I'll just call it Regions or Texas Regions or whatever will be relevant, and we'll click OK. Now, as a consequence of that, it has created essentially a tree view. I can click the plus sign. I still have individual control over each of the separate files, but I also have universal control, and that's simply turning on, turning off, as you can see right here. In this case, in my case, the grouping was based on all of these files, obviously being coverage for Texas, but you could generate these groups based on multiple data types. Maybe it's imagery, elevation, and vectors for a particular area. So your group might be defined by a particular project area or by a particular data type. In other words, if I wanted to turn off all of my shapefiles but leave all of my imagery on, or vice versa, creating groups like this, bearing in mind how your workflow works, makes your interaction with the visible map much more efficient. And it's a very simple tool. Just simply right-click and group, assign the name, it automatically creates the tree view. We often have questions about this process, and if I create a group, how do I remove the group? In other words, if I just do this as an experiment, but I don't want to keep this setting, again, very simple. We're going to select everything we'd selected previously, right-click once again. We'll go to group once again, and you'll notice it will be predefined with the name that I assigned previously. All I'm going to do is delete it, just using my delete button on my keyboard, and it reverts it back to individual layers again. So grouping as a tool, very efficient for assembling or managing multiple layers simultaneously, allowing you to turn them all off and turn them all on individually or collectively. Now, taking that process to the next level, we have a tool within Global Mapper called a map catalog. I'm going to unload my data. Before I begin, I'm actually going to create a catalog. You can approach this in two ways, by the way. I could create a catalog from some preloaded data, like I did with my grouping. But in my case, I'm actually going to generate the catalog first. And under the File menu, we have an option to create a new map catalog. I'm going to call this one Augusta. This is our state capital right up the road here. And we can save it wherever we want. I'm actually going to save it in a folder also called Augusta. And we'll click Save. Now, as soon as I create that map catalog, I'm being prompted to essentially assign layers or add layers to this catalog. In a sense, it's the same as generating the groups we did before, where we assign a single name at the top level and then the layers that apply to that. But there's a lot more involved in the catalog than there is in the grouping process. In my case, I'm going to add the files from a defined directory. And actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to add the files individually. I have 4 JPEGs here, JPEG 2000s, and I'm going to assign them. These are imagery tiles, and I've added all 4 to my map catalog. You will notice that when I add them, I do have a number of options here. I can check them on and check them off. In other words, the particular tile of imagery in this case could be part of my catalog, but temporarily invisible. I do have that option, similar to what I would do in the Overlay Control Center. I can define the visibility extent. In other words, in this case, my imagery, maybe I don't want to see it beyond a certain zoom level, and I can define how that extent is represented either by a percentage value or pixel value or scale if necessary. So I may just want these images to appear within a certain scale threshold or scale range, I guess, and I can do that. I've got those options. If we get beyond that visible range, I can define how the extent of those tiles appears by defining a box style. So in other words, a box would appear on the map as opposed to the actual imagery itself. Obviously, that's going to improve your draw speed. You don't have to draw the imagery if you don't need to see the actual contents. Only when you get in close then you'll see the imagery itself displayed. So there are a number of tools for improving efficiency even within this dialog box. We obviously can remove files that are not necessary, et cetera, et cetera. I'm simply going to click OK in this case, and it'll automatically add that catalog file. It's a GMC file that I generated, .gmcl, and it's added to the map. Now, the improved efficiency that this brings is Global Mapper now deals with a single file. Although multiple tiles of imagery have been referenced in this file, Global Mapper sees it as one file, and efficiency in terms of redraw, in terms of processing, are applied because it's not dealing with multiple individual files, or in this case, individual imagery tiles. So again, significantly improves efficiency as part of this cataloging process. Just to kind of further this, when you're working with a catalog, if you click the Options button, it will bring back up that dialog box we had seen previously, where we can choose to add additional data or remove a tile or modify any of the other settings. If you need to go and modify the raster properties like we can do with a standard layer in Overlay Control Center, we do have these buttons at the bottom right corner where we can modify the display of our raster layers. This is the typical options you would see in the Overlay Control Center. We can adjust transparency, apply blending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you still have that functionality, but now all of these settings are going to be applied universally to all of the tiles within this particular catalog. So hopefully you're picking up some hints and suggestions here, again, using Global Mapper to its fullest and most efficient way. Which brings us to scripting. I have actually, just to keep things organized, a new slide in my presentation talking about scripting and what scripting is. Basically, a script allows a user to essentially create a custom batch process within Global Mapper. We went through the batch processing from the file menu, which is fairly limited. We defined a data type, an output data type, and maybe a reprojection. So in a sense, what we're going to do here with scripting is take that basic principle but expand on it. Essentially, a script allows us to run many of the import, export, and processing tools within Global Mapper in a documented or scripted manner. And I'm going to show you some examples in just a second. As I said, a script can be used to import, process, and export data. And that middle term, process, obviously is very general. Processing might be reprojecting. It might be generating some contours from some imported elevation data. So we're not quite to the point where everything you can do within the software can be scripted, but a fairly large percentage, especially those repeated functions, can be automated in this way. A script, and people often ask this question when I talk about scripts, well, what format are we using? Well, a script, as you will see, is simply a little text file. It's a pre-formatted and standardized structure. It can be easily created or edited in Notepad. Very easy for any user to generate a script. There's an excellent online resource that shows you some of the commands that can be applied. I would suggest, if you're interested in scripting, you start with something very basic, as I'm going to do today, and build a little script for importing and exporting, and then add to that. You can add additional parameters and do more with your data. But it is a simple process of just opening up the file or creating a file in Notepad, as you'll see in just a second. A script can be run from the file menu of Global Mapper. We're going to do that first. We're going to run some very simple scripts by going to the file menu and choosing Run Script. To be more effective, a script can actually be run externally, in other words, as a background process. You can process data without even looking at Global Mapper. Global Mapper is running under the hood, so to speak, or in the background, but you can continue to work on other applications knowing that Global Mapper is doing its job and generating the files that you need. So it can be run in the file menu or as a background process. As we'll see again in a minute when we see some examples, a script takes the form of a series of command lines. Those command lines essentially define what Global Mapper is being instructed to do, and then the parameter values. So, for instance, you're importing. What do you want to do with the data when it's imported, or as it's importing? Would you want to assign it to a feature type? Do you want to generate contours? Things like that can be assigned as essentially parameter and value pairs. The easiest way to illustrate this, again, is to look at some examples. So we are going to take a look, and I'm going to come back to this slide a little bit later to recap. I'm also going to show you a reference to the online guide that we have that allows you to generate your own scripts. So I want to show you some examples, and for this, bear with me for just 1 second while I bring up the appropriate folder. And in here, I have some sample scripts. Okay, I don't think we'll have a chance to go through all of these. I'll try my best, but thankfully these have been pre-formatted, so they will not hopefully take too long. We will be using the software initially to run some of these scripts. As I mentioned, we have the file run script command. As we go on and look at some of the more advanced scripts, we're actually going to run those externally from the software. We're going to close out a global mapper and actually show you how that process can work without actually looking at the software itself. So to begin, I'm going to show you the basic structure of a script and how it begins. And I have this text file. It's a simple little notepad file that I'm going to open up. And you'll see this is very simple. This is how you begin the process of creating a script. This is a standard header that tells the application that this is a script, and you'll see we're at version 1.00. Everything that follows actually after this defines what exactly it is you want, but this is how a script begins. So if you're building a script, start with this and then build on it. So I show you that just by way of illustrating. You will notice that this is a .txt file. You can build your scripts in Notepad using that format. A script to work within Global Mapper will be converted to a .gms, Global Mapper Script file, which is what I've done with the remainder of these files. I simply changed the suffix. I heeded Windows warning that I might be messing things up. I'm fine with that. And it became a Global Mapper script. Now, for me to modify or work with these, I'm going to open them up in Notepad again, but in this case, I'm actually going to right-click and open with. So the first example I showed you was just the header. Now I'm going to show you a script that actually performs a function. Now, again, we're starting with baby steps here. My Global Mapper script version 1 is my standard heading. Now, my next command, the command that I want to follow, is this import. Very simple, very standard function. The parameter and value in this case is my file name, and then the path to the file. I've generated a folder called temp on my hard drive, right on my C drive, and I've got a folder called parcels, and I'm importing a file called parcels. So this script should hopefully initiate that very simple process. I'm going to close it. I'm going to go to my file menu. I'm going to run the script. Import the vector was the name of that script. Hopefully these are organized for my purpose, so I remember what each one does. I'll click open, and it will pop up this dialog showing me my script processing dialog box. Now, the important thing when you're running a script in the interface is to make sure if you're using data within the context of the map view, you have this box checked. In my case, I am, so I'm simply going to run my script, and you'll see the end result of that process. Now, that is my first script, very simple. All I did was ask Global Mapper to import a layer, and it did. It succeeded. So we'll onload that one. Let me close this dialog box, and we'll onload our first script file. I'm going to take a look at a couple of others here. We're going to get a little more involved as we go down this list. Again, I could have generated that initial file as a text file and then changed the suffix, but I'm obviously in the interest of my time today, I've pre-formatted all of these, so I'm going to right-click, open with Notepad once again, and you'll see, again, it's a simple little text file. This time, my initial command, import, with the same file, I've added a new parameter and value, and you'll notice these are separated by equals. File name equals, area type equals. By the way, don't worry about remembering all of these. In a little bit, I'll show you a reference to an online scripting site, which lists all of the import commands, and for each, all of the scripting commands, and for each command, it lists all of the available parameter and values that you can assign. So in my case, just as an example, I'm importing my file name again as before, and my area type is going to be parcels. Now, if you were paying attention earlier, you will have remembered that I created a new file type called parcels. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it will recognize that, and my parcels, as they're imported, will appear red. We will find out. Again, running the script, import, type, and open. And we will just run the script from the dialog box, and bingo. Again, this time we have imported and we've assigned our feature type in a fairly automated way. That was literally 2 or 3 clicks of my mouse to achieve what I've achieved here. You can see the value in this if you're repeatedly going through the same process. You're going through the same process again and again and again, and obviously within Global Mapper, it's going to take several mouse clicks and try to remember where that menu is and how did he assign the colors. Here, it's all scripted for me. I just simply click and go. And we're dealing with a single file here again. This is an overly simplistic example. You can apply this to multiple files. As you'll see in a little bit, we can pull all the files from a particular directory and import those simultaneously and process them simultaneously. developing from our baby step approach. I'm going to onload my data once again. The next example, thankfully you'll be glad to hear I'm using a different data set. We've been using the parcel a little bit too much, so I'm going to use an elevation data set. This is a standard DEM, and I'm going to import my DEM. But I'm going to actually apply another slight variation to the process. Again, opening up in Notepad, we'll see what exactly I want to do. My file name is defined. This is what I'm importing, Gardner DEM. My parameter and value in this case is, well, type auto. This is kind of a redundant command, a redundant parameter, but you can define a type of file when you import it. Without this, obviously, it will default to what it sees, which is my DEM. So it is, again, in this case, a little redundant. But the parameter and value in this case I want to define is minimum elevation, and this is 100. In this case, it's going to be 100 meters. So in my case, rather than importing the full DEM, I'm just going to import from 100 meters and above. And hopefully the result will be, as you'll see on the map, we'll just have a small subset of our elevation data imported. Once again, file, run script, and in this case it's elevation, and we'll open. I'm going through these steps pretty quickly here because we've seen those before, and we'll close the dialog box. And what you're seeing here is, it used to be, or it is in its original form, a full elevation data set, a DEM, but now I'm just viewing from 100 meters and above, and I was able to do that during the scripting process, during the import process. Now, finally, for this section, this is a very useful one. I was trying to think of examples that may be useful. Generating contours. I'm going to right-click, again, open with my Notepad. In this case, I've added an extra line here. Again, my Global Mapper script header, import file name, again, type auto. But in this case, I want to generate a new command. Once that file has been imported, I want to do something else. In this case, generating contours. And you can see some of the parameters and values here. My contour interval is defined. Do I want to generate spot elevations? This is just one of the available options under this command, and I'll say yes in this case. There will be additional options. If you go to that reference, you can see all the other behaviors that can be assigned. The result of this will be it will import my elevation and simultaneously generate contours. And this is the last one I'm going to do using this menu. So run script, contours, and open. And we'll run the script. Going through it. Dual process right now. And hopefully you'll see the end result of that is my imported elevation data, the full extent of it in this case, and my spot heights and my contours. Again, I defined that process using a script, using a simple text file. So to this point, all we've done is basically run scripts from within the application itself. Yes, it's useful to some degree, but what I'm going to show you is perhaps even more useful. I'm going to close out of the application completely. Global Mapper is no longer running. We have my PowerPoint sitting in the background. This next script I'm going to show you takes the same basic principle, the same basic process I showed previously, and ultimately exports the resulting contours. You're going to see each time we add additional function, it adds a new command. In this case, I'm repeating what I had done before, importing my DEM, generating contours. I'm not doing the spot heights in this case. But now I'm going to my export vector command. So import, contours, export. This is a fairly typical workflow. You've got a source DEM, you've got a process that you run, and now we're exporting, and we're exporting to this defined location. My file name defines the path to the folder that I want to generate my contours in. And I want to call them 10 meter SHP. This is the name of the file that will be generated. It is a shapefile. Do I want to generate a projection file? I'm going to say yes to that. And my shape type is lines in this case. So you can see I'm adding a number of additional parameters and values as part of my export process. Anybody who's used Global Mapper will be familiar with a lot of these options when exporting a shapefile. In this case, we're automating it by scripting it. So now, wish me luck on this. This is we're getting into uncharted territory because obviously we're not actually looking at the application itself. You can run a script externally, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can associate this with Global Mapper. You can run it through a batch process or a standard Windows command line. In my case, you will probably, as a clue, have noticed that the icons for my GMS file are the same icons used for Global Mapper itself. Prior to doing this, I right-click, open with, and I chose the application. Once you make that file association, your version of Windows will recognize and associate GMS files with Global Mapper. And after that, it's simply a case of double-clicking. I want to double-click on that file, and you'll notice there's nothing to see here except my little status wheel indicating that there's a process going on, and obviously, a little bit of time depending on the amount of data. If I open up the folder, actually, let me open up a different folder here so we can, let me open in a new window, because I want to keep the previous one open, and under my temp file, hopefully, if this works, we should have generated some contours. Now, I didn't show you the before and after in this case. You'll have to take my word for it, but you can also see the time here, 10:52. Reminder to self, we're getting near the end. But you can see this file was generated. I didn't see the software. I didn't have to. I asked Global Mapper to look at this DEM, to generate the contours based on my parameters, and to generate a shapefile, just as a very specific example. Again, very small file in this case, but you can run this scripting process for multiple files, for a large volume of data, and be busy working on other things without Global Mapper actually visible on the screen. So again, that's another example of a script. Continuing this theme, we have a couple of other examples. In this example, I'm just going to show you it once again. We will go and open a notepad. In this case, different file. In this case, it's some imagery. I'm importing a JPEG 2000. In this case, I'm actually going to crop that imagery, but the area to which I'm going to crop it is defined by an external file. I have another file. It's actually a shape file. It's actually a circular area. You will see the end result of this. We'll actually see the file being generated, and I'll open up Global Mapper and we'll actually see what that looks like. But in this case, we are importing a large area of imagery and simply cropping it down to a circular area. And once again, I'm going to double-click on this. Again, process is running through. In this case, it's going to take a little bit longer, perhaps, because we're dealing with raster processing. By way of preparation, I'll go ahead and load up Global Mapper, and we'll be prepared to see the end result of our processing. Let me bring up this location to see if my cropped imagery has been generated. It looks like it has. Once again, we're looking at a new file, just finished processing. And we'll bring up Global Mapper, and we'll see if it actually worked. In this case, I'm just going to drag and drop it into my interface, and there we go. We generated some cropped imagery. The circular feature was my shapefile, so I referenced an external file for the purpose of cropping in this case. Again, you can see, obviously in my case, these are all pre-formatted, but I'm able to do various reasonably advanced functions within Global Mapper through simply double-clicking on a file on my desktop. Okay, I've got a couple more. Before we wrap up, let me bring up my folder once again. Reprojection. Now, reprojection involves a different process, a slightly different process, because in order to reproject, Global Mapper scripts require you to define the projection parameters. As you'll see, in this case, by the way, one of the things I haven't had in all of my scripts is this onload all. It's a good idea to begin each script with a simple onload all command. That ensures that there's no pre-existing data that it's going to try to work with. You're essentially wiping the slate clean. In this case, I have an onload all command as a beginning command. And then importing, this is my parcels layer is being imported. We know it's a shapefile. The projection parameters are predefined within that. That's a UTM zone 19 file. I know that just from personal experience. But what I want to do is I want to essentially export that as a state plane coordinate system, SPC, in this case, zone 1802 file. And before I do that, I have to define the projection parameter. So I have a new command here to define the projection, my projection name, and then you'll see the parameters that are established here. And it's also important that I end the defined projection. So this small section of my script essentially serves to define these projection parameters. After that has been defined, I can then choose to load the projection, which again is based on this name, the name that I previously assigned. And it will assign the projection and ultimately will export my shapefile. So this is an example of how we can take an existing file, a shapefile, define the projection, reprojection parameters, and then export it in the same format. And I've assigned it a different name, as you can see here, my state plane coordinate system name. Very quickly, I'm going to go through this. And let me, first of all, make sure I know where it's going to end up so I don't lose myself. So I'm exporting it back into the same folder. So it's going to be in parcels once again. Let me close the script. We will double-click to initiate the scripting process. You'll see again, the only clue that something's happening is that little Windows icon indicating there's a process going on. Global Mapper, although it's running behind the scenes, didn't actually do anything this time. We didn't actually see it. It didn't have to be running. I'll go up one level, and I'll go into my parcels there. And there you can see, again, just created a new version of the original layer, and in my case, renamed with the SPCS appended text to imply this now state plane coordinate system. So there is an example of using a script for a very specific purpose to take a file and reproject it based on the parameters that I defined. My assumption is when you're working through these types of workflows or looking at these and thinking how they can be used in your context, there are probably a limited set of possibilities that you need to assign here. Although the capability of scripting pretty much is virtually limitless as far as reprojection and file formatting is concerned, chances are you don't use all the formats or have a need for all those projections. So you can pre-build a number of template scripts that define the typical projections and file formats you work with, and again, simplify your workflow. Okay, the next example is going to be importing multiple files and exporting a single file. And this is a very quick one as well. Let me bring up my sample scripts folder, merging files. When we went through the batch process to merge those Texas files we had before, it generated the same number of export files. In other words, there were 12 files in, 12 KMZ files were exported or generated from that. In this case, again, based on the default behavior of Global Mapper, we can import multiple files and export a single file. Now, you'll notice a slightly different command at the start, import my directory tree. I'm defining the directory. Within that directory, I'm looking for every file that contains or ends, in this case, there's my wildcard, but ends with .shp. So I'm importing all of the files from this directory that end with .shp. So there's going to be, we know about 12 files that will be imported, but I'm exporting a single file. My single file will be called regions.shp. And again, my shapefile parameters have been defined. So in this case, multiple files imported, single file exported. And run it. Wait for my status wheel to finish, and you can see processing going on. Let's go up one level here. And hopefully, oops, sorry, back one level. There we go. Again, we generated my regions there. And I've noticed, I keep looking at the time here when these files were generated. We'll run one more, and then we'll wrap it up for our session today. Hopefully, you have a little bit of time to follow this last one. So again, a single file generated from multiple import files in this case. Now, the final script I'm going to show you is an example of how we can essentially loop through a directory, or rather than, as I did previously, essentially grab a number of files and run a process that generates a single file. Using this final example, we can generate a process whereby Global Mapper will address each individual file within a folder, run through whatever process I define, and then export each of those individual files. Now, in many cases, this is a very useful function. Let's, again, think in terms of processing some imagery. The imagery tiles, perhaps there's 200-300 imagery tiles that you simply need to convert from a specific format to another format. Okay, granted, the batch processing would work in that case, but if there's any other processing, perhaps raster processing needs to be assigned, you would have to build a script. In this case, we begin our script with a loop start. Basically, we're defining a directory, a loop directory from which to start this process, and this, again, is my source file. Again, we're defining the file name mask, all of our shape files. We're going to import all of the files. There are parameters you'll see in the reference guide, I'll show you in just a second, that allow us to basically choose how those files are defined within that directory. And then ultimately, we're going to export all of those as individual files. Finally, we're going to unload all, and we're going to finish our loop. In other words, we're beginning a loop, running through the process with each individual file, and then ending the loop at the end. And that's how this process basically works. And again, in this case, I'm generating DXF files, and we can define the DXF parameters within our script as well. So finally, let's go ahead and run this one. And again, I got to verify where these are going to be added to. I keep forgetting to look. Okay, Texas DXF is the name of the folder. We will go ahead and run this. And while it's going through that processing, again, we know there are about a dozen individual files. We'll go find that directory while it's going through the process. I believe it's in here, and we will check, and there we go. So we've generated individual DXF files from individual shape files. And that is a series of examples of scripting and how scripting works in Global Mapper. As I mentioned, there is an excellent online guide, and I have a local example here. I don't want to use up my bandwidth, and I want to show you a locally saved version. This you will find on our website. I'll bring up the URL in just a second in my concluding PowerPoint slide. But this reference guide shows you all of the commands. You can see the list of commands, import and export, obviously the common ones, generating contours, generating an elevation grid. You're working with some elevation data, you can automatically generate elevation grid. Number of additional commands in here. And for each of these commands, we'll choose our generate contours. I'm just going to click on the link. Takes us to that section and shows us all the parameters and values that can be assigned when generating contours. And obviously multiple commands can be stacked. You can have some very intricate scripts. Hopefully today we give you an introduction, get you thinking about this. Come into this dialog box or this web page and start to build your scripts and try to mirror some of those processes that you go through in a manual way, and you'll see how simple and automated it can be. As I said, if I bring up my PowerPoint once again, here is the URL. I'm going to leave this slide up for just a second while we conclude. This is the URL that includes that script reference. If for whatever reason you have nothing to write on or you don't get this noted down, go to our web page, go to the support section on our web page, and it's under our knowledge base. So again, we'll have the Blue Marble Geo web page, click the support menu, go to knowledge base, and you'll find a link to the same information. And again, it's the same HTML that I showed you in that locally saved version. So that wraps us up for today. Hopefully you got some insight into some of the tools in Global Mapper that have been designed for efficiency, both efficiency of working with data in the context of the software itself and processing data either through batch processing or through scripting. Thank you once again for taking the time to learn more about Global Mapper. We will come around next month again, and we will continue our monthly webinar series, and hopefully you'll again pick up additional information. Once again, thank you for attending today.